All right, apparently there's a new controversy on Twitter about the land back thing. So it got me thinking about the land back debates in 2021 and how, looking back, um, it was like Fed boosted 100%. Like there's no, look. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. It's not rocket science. Why couldn't we just disagree over this in a civil way? Why did it have to get to the point where it's like, oh, you're a Nazi because you disagree with me about, like, why did they have to escalate it the way they did? It's like, yeah, the mental illness is there, but think about it in person, in real life. If you went and talked to someone who claims to be a communist just like you, claims to be a Marxist-Leninist, who fully, exonerates communist states and recognizes their achievements and supports them. And it's like you just disagree about the national question in the United States. Is that grounds for like really saying, oh, you are literally someone who needs to be shot in the head with a shotgun and murdered and beheaded and killed because you don't agree with me about this? It's like this is such a theoretical issue. I don't think there had to have had been so much like hostility over it on their part. It wasn't we didn't start the fire. See, guerrillas are known for being extremely aggressive and bullies, but it's all self-defense. And I'm not telling you guys to soften your stance, harden your hearts, if anything, all right? Harden your hearts, because nobody respects weakness. They will try to trample all over you, and you'll be like Douglas Lane or something. They'll just trample over you, and you'll just be some weak post-left, complainer that everyone just tramples over and nobody fucking respects. But in the interest of actually not being a Fed and a wrecker, the option is always there to just disagree in a civil way. I've always extended that option to anyone. Why don't you just disagree with us in a normal civil way? Why does it have to be so belligerent and hostile though? Like really why? Because let me just it's just like when Deng Xiaoping told Gorbachev, like, okay, we had problems in the past, but here's where we stand. This is our position. Here's where we stand. All right? No need to make it anything extra. So there's someone, I don't know the names, I forget. I just know that guerrillas are entangled in this dispute. So let's just talk about what the infrared stance is, all right? The official infrared stance on the national question in the USA. So I used to have the same view as some of these people in the sense that there are multiple oppressed nations in America, that America, too, is a prison house of nations, just like the Russian Empire was. I used to think there's a black nation, and there's a Latino nation, and there's an indigenous nation, and there's all these different nations, and there needs to be a, what was it called, Rainbow Coalition-style alliance between all the progressive forces of national liberation and the communist national forces of America. It's not just white people, but the American nation, whatever. And it's just that kind of like, it's like not a confederacy like the Confederacy of the South, but like a confederation, coalition, of these different forces, right? And to be fair, the CPUSA used to propose the Black Belt thesis in the 30s. They used to be their official line, and they used to have that same analysis. But as I've come to mature, I don't agree with it anymore. And here's why. I don't agree with it because here's the strange question you have to ask. And this is not a bad faith question. Let's have an open inquiry. Let's actually think about it. Like, genuinely, what's your response to this? Are they going to propose that there is a white nation in the United States? Think about it. Is there a white nation? Because if we concede to the actual reactionaries of U.S. history, like the Ku Klux Klan, that there is a white nation distinct from the American nation, you've just conceded the fundamental premise and purport of white nationalism. And look, I'm not here to cancel you and call you a white nationalist or someone who sympathizes with white nationalism. Even if you want to define white people as an oppressor nation exclusively, the fact that you're identifying a white nation, I find that to be problematic from a Marxist perspective. Not just like a moral, political perspective, but a theoretical perspective. There is nothing about the way in which the so-called white nation is defined in America, which presumably is the American nation, who speaks the common language of English, who shares a similar relationship to the American state and so on. But nothing about that excludes non-white people. Nothing about that definition of the nation excludes. I mean, there's discrimination, there's prejudice, I'm not denying that, but the strict Stalin definition of a nation cannot say there's a white nation distinct from the American nation as a whole. So we have to probe this question even further. I mean, if you're going to claim there's a white nation, what is the content of the white nation? Like, who is a part of it and who isn't? Are the Ellis Island immigrants part of the white nation? And then they're going to say, well, it's about white supremacy. And it's like, well, really think about this from a Marxist perspective. Because you cannot apply the traditional Marxist-Leninist understanding of the national question here. If you want to get into, what is it called? Anti-blackness theory or whatever, which is literally ontologizing black and white to understand the root of white supremacy. Like, if you want to get into that stuff, get into it. Just don't say it's Marxism-Leninism. Because Marxism-Leninism is trying to understand relationships between nations. I'll give you examples. Lenin believed that the German attempts to control the Balkans and the Slavic peoples in the Balkans, like Serbia, was a form of national chauvinism. And that was a relation of an oppressor nation and an oppressed nation. He believed that the French in Africa was a relation between an oppressor nation and an oppressed nation. Okay? But in his understanding of the relationship between these different nations, Lenin still believed there was a German nation and there was a French nation, and these were legitimate nations. These were legitimate, historically constituted peoples. And even if he opposes their chauvinism toward others, he's not going to say, France needs to be abolished and Germany needs to be abolished. He recognizes those as legitimate, historically constituted nations. So that's the Marxist-Leninist national question. If you're trying to apply the national question to America, and if you're trying to interpret race relations in America in terms of relationships between different nations, again, this is a view I used to sympathize with, so I'm not trying to, how should I say, talk down on anyone or belittle them for it, because I understand where it's coming from. Because we're trying to sort out, like, how should we understand the racial problems in this country? And if we're Marxist-Leninists, of course, we want to go back to what we are familiar with, which is the national question, which is not in and of itself wrong. But I think we're jumping the gun when we make the assumption that America's races are discretely defined and separate nations. I think that's an extremely problematic assumption to make. I think it's not just problematic politically, it's also overlooks the nuances and the dynamics of, for example, you're identifying a distinct black nation in the Black Belt or something, right? But how do you square that with the fact that the so-called black nation is so interdependent in terms of its own identity and in terms of its own reality culturally with a specific relationship toward white people, and not just a negative one either. How do you square it with the fact that black culture and Southern white culture are like so fundamentally similar, and that in the South, even to this day, people assume the South is like the most racist place ever, but I kind of beg to differ, because Southern whites and Southern black people have a very special type of solidarity that isn't necessarily there in the North or in the West. And you only if you're from there, you know what I'm talking about. But there is a sense of like solidarity culturally and whatever between these groups, even if they're different groups and they're different culturally or whatever. To say that they're a different nation, I think would be really pushing it. It's not a different nation, it's a cultural subdivision within the same nation. It doesn't take much to see how black Americans are very distinctly American. They may be distinct from other Americans, but anywhere from the perspective of anyone else in the world, they're very American. You know, black music, food, culture, it's all American. Even the hip hop, gangster rap, all of that is pure Wild West, you know, outlaw, cowboy type of stuff. It's all it's 100% American culture, all right? It's 100% American. There's not even 1% of it that's un-American. It's 100% American, okay? Is it culturally distinct from others? Yeah, because there are different, I agree that there are different peoples here who have different lineages and who have different histories that brought them here. I agree with that. Like, I'm not denying that. But it's a strange limbo situation where there is a level of distinction between people, but not enough for that distinction to be a national distinction. There's a fundamental intertwinedness of these distinct peoples where they're not yet historically constituted nations, but they seem to be in this state of like national superposition or something, where it's like two forms of the same nation at once, right? Simultaneously existing, or three or four or whatever. So I would like to propose an alternative to the view that there's several different oppressed nations in America. And I would also like to provide an alternative to the other extreme, which says there is no national question in America at all, and that it's resolved completely and there's no national question. What if the national question in America is precisely about the fact that we haven't yet become a fully constituted nation, the American nation? What if we are all part of the same nation, which is still in the process of coming to be and to forming as such, as one civilization, as one people, as one nation? What if Martin Luther King's dream wasn't just a dream, but was actually approximating and giving expression to a shared destiny that we can all sense that we have? There's all these problems, sure, but it's like we are all Americans, part of the same nation. And that isn't to say that there aren't injustices committed against black people or indigenous people or whatever else you want to have. But what if you should understand those injustices in terms of the struggle of one American nation? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with recognizing the injustice committed against red Americans as a form of injustice being committed against the American nation itself? Like, in order for there to be one American nation, these racial forms of oppression need to be overcome. Obviously, they do. That's part of what the American nation is. That's part of how it could even exist as a fully constituted nation. And what if we should understand the racial questions in this country as a question of the common struggle of the American people? It's a common struggle of the American people to discover themselves as a nation, to exist as a nation. And we shouldn't see it in terms of see, look, we can say Germany is fucking with the Serbs and oppressing the Serbs because we're all in agreement that Germany is a distinct nation from Serbia. We recognize Germany. We also recognize Serbia, right? Whatever. But do we really want to go ahead and say, oh yeah, white and black are distinct nations, and justice means white people forming their own nation and then black people having their own nation? In other words, let's balkanize America into racial ethno-states. And it's like, I disagree. I think we should understand ourselves as one people who are struggling to be. We are one people who are in the process of a long historical struggle. It's not that long, to be honest. But some kind of historical struggle to form a new civilization. And why shouldn't we understand in that struggle a horizon for a uniquely communist-led form of civilization building and nation forming? A nation formed that is simultaneously, it's like the dream of the new Soviet man, basically. Like, America is a nation struggling to be formed simultaneously that it is struggling to defeat and overcome the barbarism of capitalism. Because we know what the origin of the racial oppression is. We know it's in capitalism, right? We know that these are part of the... We know, for example, that the dispossession of the land of the Red Indians, the Red Americans, that was a part of the barbarism of capitalism. And nobody ever denied that, by the way. But we can't just say that, oh, that's the barbarism of capitalism, so socialism automatically fixes that. I understand where they're coming from when they say that. They're like, oh, you need to address the national reality. Like, I get that, you know? But what if instead of the intersectional nonsense where you're trying to say, oh, yeah, I mean, these are just different hierarchies of oppression. What if instead we recognize America cannot come into existence as a nation without simultaneously also becoming a socialist civilization? I mean, that's really why communists historically were so optimistic about America's prospects for communism or socialism, you know? Because the only way we can contextualize the birth of an American civilization or the emergence of an American nation is simultaneously in the transition from the capitalist to the socialist mode of production. I think that's much more powerful than land back nonsense. You know, land back nonsense, which is, look, you know, I don't know. We've given our concerns, you know, like, this is a privatization scheme. This is just a scam way to bypass any semblance of popular sovereignty and have this unaccountable way of privatizing land and creating, you know, and then they would respond and be like, okay, no, we just believe in land reform. And it's like, look, if it's just land reform, why are you antagonizing us? We don't disagree with you. And they go, because you're fundamentally racist, because you are white supremacists, and you would never agree that the Red Indians should have their own land. The Red Americans. Okay, I mean, that's where I'm going to come in and be like, I feel like feds are behind this shit. Because, like, look, if it's just land reform, there's not much disagreement. There really isn't. So why are you, like, constantly pushing to try and impose an antagonism where there isn't one? Isn't that weird? Isn't that a little strange? Like, no, we're not white supremacists because we don't believe there's a white nation. We believe there's one American nation. And no, we don't believe in imposing the dominant European-based culture on all of the other Americans. Because we don't believe America is a European civilization. It's an American civilization, which is taking elements from Europe, which is taking elements from the indigenous Indian civilizations here, which is taking elements from African civilization, and something new is arising out of that, right? So no, we don't believe in so-called white supremacy. We don't believe in white nationalism. So why is there this bad faith where they're just like accusing us of all this crazy stuff? Oh, you guys are racist, you're what? Why? Why are you saying that? It literally doesn't make sense. Who gains from that? Who gains from who gains from just creating these arbitrary discursive barriers? Like, look, from an outsider's perspective, it's so bizarre. Like, who gains from these discursive barriers preventing the possibility for any common understanding to be arrived at? Like, I understand where you're coming from, so try to understand where we're coming from. It's not a place of, bigotry or chauvinism or whatever the hell else you're trying to say. I've just told you what it is. I think it's not quite sufficient to say that these are distinct nations, that racial groups are distinct nations, quote-unquote racial groups. It's not nuanced enough to understand the dynamics. And I propose an alternative view. And, I feel like it's a reasonable perspective. But who gains from these discursive barriers? Like, what's the point? Honestly, what's the point? Like, you don't have to agree with us. You don't have to agree with me. If you don't agree with me, present your argument. Present why you disagree. I'm not an unreasonable person. I try to see my opponent's perspective to the best of my ability, So this is just what I'm saying. It's like, why is it something? I really feel like it's some Fed shit. I honestly just like, it's some Fed shit. Like, why? Think about it. Just stop being emotional. Take a step back and think about it. Like, who gains from blowing it out of proportion like that? We are not overlooking where you're coming from. Trust me, we're not. We understand. You can't just ignore the national reality in this country. You can't just ignore the reality of race relations and the way that, the red Americans have been dealt a really short end of the stick. There's no way to just pretend that we're not saying like, oh, that happened a long time ago, so who cares? It has no pressing relevance. On the contrary, it has an immediate relevance, and I'd be the first one to say that. It has an immediate relevance because the fact that that has not been resolved is such a stark proof that America as a nation hasn't figured itself out. It's in a state of confusion about what it itself is. And, I do believe in a fundamental and ultimate historical justice for the indigenous Americans. I'm not saying, oh, it happened a long time ago, so it doesn't matter. I'm just saying I don't think it matters in the way you're trying to make it seem like it does, in the sense of like, this means that everything can just be returned to the prior state. Because that's what I don't agree with. I don't think we could just return to the past. I don't think the red Americans agree with that either, by the way. I think we should understand the encounter between the European frontiersmen. I would call them American frontiersmen, actually, because they were trying to go away from Europe. Now, how successful they were, you have a right to say they weren't that successful. They were emulating much of the same patterns as of the European colonialism that they founded America to get away from. I agree with that. But understand that the purport of this nation, of America, of the United States of America, was always to move away from that. However failed it was because of the barbarism of so-called capitalist civilization. But we don't want to return to the past because we can't. Because even if we do want it, it's in vain because it's not possible. There is no way to return to the past and undo that horrific and tragic confrontation between different historically constituted peoples and one not being treated with the human dignity and respect and recognition that they deserved to be treated with, right? But, but to say that it's like, to say that it was, there was a lack of mutual recognition, and there was a lack of mutual recognition, and there was a lack of the recognition of the reality of the indigenous people, precisely because the American frontiersmen didn't even understand themselves. They didn't even understand what America was. They didn't understand what a civilization is. What is it? What does it mean for a people to be constituted as a people, with a shared, historically constituted reality? Even they did not understand that as applied to themselves. It was the dog-eat-dog barbarism of capitalism, all against all. Sell out your own mother to slavery if it turns a profit, right? So that needs to be appreciated. I believe there should be a forgiveness of the evils of the founding sins of this country. And they should be contextualized within a larger historical process of a struggle of a nation coming to be. So look at how much sensitivity and respect I have on this issue, much more than any Marxist historically did, by the way. Most Marxists historically, this is also a fact you should reckon with. And you know who appreciates this is the guy that you call a fascist is Dugin. This is what Dugin criticizes about Marxism, by the way. You don't believe me, ask him. Marxists historically looked upon this issue. You can read this in Marx's writings about the U.S.-Mexico War and Engels' writings about the Slavs in 1848. But historically, the view was, this is before Lenin's time. You know, the classical Marxist view, and this isn't the same as, I'm so sick of the misuse of the word chauvinism. Chauvinism is not bigotry. They're different things. Chauvinism is not bigotry. Lenin described chauvinism as a stance, policy stance of social democratic parties in relation to the imperialist war. And it wasn't because they were oppressing Ewoks in the forest or whatever noble savage fantasy you have. It was because they were siding with the newly forming imperial hegemonies, which were imperial not in the sense of, they're destroying Mother Nature and its Ewoks, but in the sense that they were, this is because you have this noble savage Star Wars-based conception, I don't know. But because it was circumventing bourgeois democracy and the bourgeois form of the republic. Okay, so they were chauvinistic because of their enthusiasm for the war. And the enthusiasm for the war was a bad thing in Lenin's view, because not because Lenin was a pacifist, he wasn't, by the way, but because put it this way, that war granted an unprecedented ability for the bourgeoisie, the imperialist bourgeoisie, to suspend domestic civil liberties, to basically destroy the international solidarity of the social democratic movement, the communist movement. I mean, it wasn't called communist, whatever, at the time. It was a war which basically established this dynamic in which the socialist movement was sacrificing the sovereign interests of the proletariat in the name of, the defense of the fatherland or something. Keep in mind, it was a historically successful, already existing movement, the social democratic movement, Second International, and all of that was just being sacrificed opportunistically because the social democratic politicians in parliament wanted to curry favor with the then forming hegemonies in Europe. So they were selling out, basically, It wasn't based on this humanitarian philanthropic view. I'm just sick of the abuse of the word chauvinism, FYI. But yes, bigotry is a word you should use instead if that's what you're trying to say. And the classical... See, Soviet Marxism made it more civilized and human and sensitive to the diversity of different cultures and civilizations in the world. Crass, thank you so much. Why? Because this is what the Soviets themselves reckoned with internally. And it was part of their humanistic outlook, pro-humanity, powerful humanity outlook. It wasn't charity. And that comes from Lenin. But the pre-Lenin social democratic and Marx and Engels held these views as well. View was bigoted and ignorant in many ways toward non-Western peoples, especially indigenous people. The view that they had was like, that the dispossession of the land from the indigenous, whatever, they spun that as historically progressive. It was an advance of history, however bloody, however unjust, and however, full of villainy and whatever. They still regarded it as historically progressive and a triumph of the forces of production over these primitive, backwards people. That was a mainstream classical Marxist view. And it's Dugin who raises this critique. It's Dugin who strongly... Thank you, Circuit. It's Dugin who strongly problematizes, let's say, that aspect within classical Marxism. And in his rejection of Marxism, he places a strong emphasis precisely on that Eurocentric aspect. And I think it's a fair criticism. It's not fundamental to Marxism, but that was a classical Marxist view rooted in a type of ignorance which did not recognize with enough depth or enough appreciation the social being of these unique and different forms of civilization of humanity, such as the Red Americans. I agree that Marxism traditionally has been very insensitive. Pre-Soviet Marxism was very insensitive to the reality of American indigenous people. Like, I agree. So to have a loftier and higher perspective, we shouldn't make this. We shouldn't try to cancel people and do this nonsense. Because if you can forgive Marx for being bigoted, you should be able to forgive people who don't see it the same way as you now, and actually genuinely try to persuade them that you're correct. I don't think we're bigoted at all toward indigenous Americans. I don't think that's our stance at all. I don't think it is bigotry. I don't think it is prejudice. I think that people have gotten too comfortable with calling people names as a way to force your opinion on them. And it's just like, that's not how it works. You have to be an adult. Stop being a child.